There is a significant distinction between us as a mutual aid group and the emergency relief efforts in classics that emerged in 2020. While we set up Sportula Europe in the context of the pandemic, we understand that the crises it revealed are not new. So while emergency relief funds are a welcome band-aid, they risk implying that the systems prior to the pandemic were operating within acceptable parameters. As a group of people who live at various intersections of social marginalization, we know for ourselves through our lived experience and our witnessing of the world and academic institutions in the last 10 years, that the narrative of improvement just isn't the case. In the UK, cuts to the public sector have impacted our entire lives in higher education. What we do as a mutual aid group within academia addresses the system-wide failures that compound systemic pressure on the bodies of Black and Brown, queer, and disabled people. At its most ambitious, Sportula Europe imagines new ways of surviving and thriving together, orientated towards racial and economic justice. And that, to say the least, is not a short-term goal or one circumscribed to reacting only to the immediate disaster of the global pandemic. So what is mutual aid if not emergency relief? Dean Spade recounts in Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, that on the day when the first COVID-19 case was announced in Hong Kong, some protesters who had been in the streets resisting police and government turned their attention to creating a website that tracked cases, monitored hotspots, reported hospital wait times, etc. This coordinated movement undertook grassroots political action at the level it was needed, that was more effective at containing the first wave of the pandemic than any of their government responses. Another example of mutual aid is the work of the Black Panthers in Oakland, California. Though widely perceived as only a politically militant group, their quietly radical work is overlooked. The Panthers dealt with the material conditions of Black people's lives around housing, access to healthcare, and education. Fred Hampton was passionate about the needs for kids to have a square meal to start the day, and so the free breakfast program was set up. And it is hard to miss the echo of Marcus Rashford, the young Black British footballer shaming the British government into providing adequate food for children during the school closures enforced by the pandemic. Both examples illustrate that we must see and act beyond the narrowly circumscribed political and life-making activities states and institutions, job markets, and pipelines plunge us into. As Mathura observed recently, capitalism is a death cult that many of us are not supposed to survive. Mutual aid is how we can make new ways of surviving and thriving, having political imagination beyond what is given to us. Mutual aid has been around long before the 20th century. We could name countless examples wherein colonized people have improved ways to help one another get around the concentration of wealth and resources into the hands of the greedy few. And so solidarity is the principle at the heart of mutual aid, which in addition to having a longer term and more capacious political framework, sets us apart from COVID emergency funds or outreach type grant setups. Lola Olufemi puts it thus: solidarity is hard to define. In the simplest terms, it can range from working across difference, standing together in the face of shared oppression, and standing alongside those with whom you do not share a common experience of the world. It's a slippery concept. It moves about. It unites and divides the movements we are part of. A feminist definition might understand solidarity as a strategic coalition of individuals who are invested in a collective vision for the future. At the core of solidarity is mutual aid, the idea that we give our platforms, resources, legitimacy, voices, skills to one another to try and defeat oppressive conditions. We give and take from one another. We become accomplices and saboteurs and disruptors on each other's behalf, end quote. Because we are not trying to save the discipline of classics, we focus on giving and taking among one another. As well as the 5 of us who run Sportula Europe, many of our regular and one-off donors have experiences of marginalization and financial precarity in academia. Several have reached out to say that they are paying forward the support which they have previously received from the Sportula, and many of our micro-grantees express their intention to donate to us in the future when their circumstances allow. This is part of what separates mutual aid from charity. Sportula Europe was not born out of a perceived duty to help less fortunate students, but out of an awareness that our survival as individuals depends on the construction and survival of our communities. Sportula Europe has solidarity at its core because we understand ourselves as sharing some common experience of the world as much as of some common experience of discipline and institution. Classics has loved to regard itself as savior with preservative functions for civilization, even as it has positioned itself in need of redeeming or saving. Our shared and overlapping experiences as BIPOC, queer, disabled people in classics has taught us that unless we make our own spaces to ensure our mutual survival and flourishing, this discipline will always fit us badly, set us as marginal, or in countless other ways ensure that we are harmed.
Solidarity also means recognizing that we as students and researchers study and work within a world much broader than our discipline and institution. How this recognition is translated into practical action depends much on specific geographical and temporal contexts. But we as Sportula Europe consider there to be a number of unifying features for thinking about enacting a politics of solidarity in our roles of students, researchers, and teachers of the ancient world. Firstly, solidarity is not simply bringing more people from more diverse backgrounds into the discipline. Solidarity works to change the discipline and the institution. It's about supporting each other and joining together on a non-hierarchical, spontaneous basis to effect structural change. To return to Fred Hampton, one of his unique threats to capitalist white supremacy was to bring together different groups who, on the surface, had little in common. The white young patriots, the Latino group, the Young Lords, and the Black Panthers, among others, and to form a rainbow coalition to offer a united front against a common enemy which oppressed and exploited working class people regardless of skin color. Of course, this is not to say that all forms of oppression amount to the same thing, but solidarity means identifying common themes in different struggles, areas around which to organize, as well as being available as an ally in struggles different to your own. As this should help hopefully illustrate, solidarity is an altogether different creature from a politics of representation. Solidarity addresses material as well as epistemological conditions. How can one be expected to work or study if one is struggling to make rent, afford the weekly shop, or buy a train ticket home? Often these material struggles are bound up in layers of stigma, especially in a discipline which remains so intensely entangled with social class. Solidarity aims to provide a basic level of security to allow our colleagues and friends to feel able to work. Yet it extends further than this. Given our location, much of our perspective is heavily skewed towards the UK, and what follows reflects this. In the recent book, Empire's Endgame, Racism and the British State, the authors draw attention to the inadequacy of a politics of representation in a university context. Representational politics tends to be centered on those who already have some sort of institutional affiliation, as students, employees, or as British citizens. Where does this leave outsourced support staff in universities, whose immigration status is sometimes precarious, leaving them open to intimidation and abuse, most obviously seen at SOAS, University of London? The alliance formed between cleaning staff, students, and academic staff at SOAS, framed by engagements with histories of colonialism, many of the support staff were from Central and South America, won a historic victory in securing in-house employment for support staff, giving them access to better working conditions and protection, and setting a precedent for similar struggles across University of London campuses. When we speak of a decolonized university, we need to be clear of what we mean. If, as some universities now market the term, decolonization means more non-white faces, more diverse course readings, then, as Empire's Endgame asks, who would clean a decolonized university? Solidarity is not a hagiography of trade unionism. Recent industrial actions undertaken by the University and College Union in the UK have shown that often well-established hierarchical unions represent the interests of their most senior and secure members, throwing their precarious colleagues under the proverbial bus. Recent militant, non-hierarchical wildcat actions in US contexts show how effective radical grassroots organizing can be in defiance of ossified hierarchical organizations. This is why we, the Sportula Europe, do not solicit the patronage of famous classicists. We aim to build a network of solidarity based on the principle that an injury to one is an injury to all, rather than providing a philanthropic outlet for senior colleagues to assuage their underlying guilt.